The fluorescent hum of the overhead lights was a constant companion in the forensic anthropology bone analysis lab, a low, buzzing drone that always seemed to sharpen my focus. Today, that focus was on a small, charred section of a human femur, no bigger than my thumb. It lay on a sterile white tray under the harsh beam of my stereomicroscope, a stark, grim testament to the violence that had ended Dr. Aris Thorne's life. I adjusted the magnification, my eye pressed to the eyepiece, the familiar scent of ozone and disinfectant clinging to the air. The initial reports had been quick, almost too quick. Catastrophic lab accident, volatile chemicals, and explosion. A tragic miscalculation, they said, or perhaps a desperate act. Suicide. But the preliminary findings from the explosion site, already catalogued and cross-referenced, felt neat. Too neat. The bone fragment under my scope was heavily calcined, almost pure white in places where the heat had been most intense. Yet even through the destruction I could make out faint striations, almost like miniature valleys running across the surface. These weren't the typical stress fractures from the explosion's concussive force, nor were they consistent with thermal expansion. They were too uniform, too deliberate. My brow furrowed. I traced the pattern with a fine-tipped probe, barely touching the fragile surface. It was as if something had etched itself into the bone before the extreme heat. A precise, almost surgical score, disguised by the subsequent incineration. The official line was that the blast had been so powerful, so all-consuming, that it had obliterated most of the finer details. Yet here was a detail, small as it was, refusing to be obliterated. Anything interesting, read. The assistant lab manager, a young woman with a perpetually cheerful demeanor that always seemed at odds with our line of work, poked his head around the corner. She held a stack of plastic-sleeved evidence tags. Just admiring the artistry of thermal decomposition, I replied, not looking up, though this particular piece has a peculiar history. She chuckled, then moved on, probably to tag another collection of shattered glass or singed fabric. For her, it was routine. For me, it was the first tremor. I pulled back from the scope, rubbing my eyes. My internal clock was already ticking, a quiet counterpoint to the lab's hum. The official narrative was already hardening, solidifying into an unassailable truth. Dr. Thorne, the reclusive bioengineer, brilliant but perhaps unstable, had pushed the boundaries too far, or simply given up. The world-changing research he'd been rumored to be on the cusp of discovering, now reduced to ash and speculation. But those faint striations on the bone, they whispered a different story. They were too sharp, too precise for a random accident. I knew I needed to see the lab itself, not just the fragments it had coughed up. This small bone chip, barely a gram, was a tiny thread, but it snagged at my mind, pulling me towards a deeper, darker possibility. The bioengineering lab, or what was left of it, was a scene of controlled chaos. Police tape crisscrossed the entrance, a bright yellow sentinel against the building's otherwise pristine, modern facade. Inside, the air hung heavy with the acrid scent of burnt chemicals and damp concrete. A fine layer of gray ash coated everything, a macabre dusting over the twisted metal and shattered glass. Quite the mess, isn't it? The lead detective, a burly man named Miller with a perpetually tired expression, gestured vaguely at the destruction. He stood near what used to be a workbench, now a mangled heap of scorched steel. Initial assessment still holds, looks like a pressure vessel blew. Thorne was working with some highly reactive compounds, we think, volatile stuff. I walked past him, my eyes scanning, trying to reconstruct the scene in my mind. The damage was extensive, a concentrated blast zone right in the heart of the lab. It certainly looked like an accident or a suicide. The detective's theory was plausible, easy to accept. Too easy. Any signs of forced entry? I asked, my voice barely a murmur as I stepped over a tangle of wires. None. Security's airtight here. Biometric scans, retinal ID, everything. The Professor Thorne and a couple of senior researchers had access to this particular lab, and the others were accounted for, alibis checked out. Miller consulted a tablet. The security logs show Thorne entered at 02:17 and never left. Explosion registered at 03:42. Locked himself in, did the deed, or made a mistake. Case closed mostly. My gaze drifted to a section of the wall further from the epicenter of the blast. The paint was peeling, scorched, but not obliterated. I knelt, my gloved hand brushing away a layer of ash. Below the charred surface, almost imperceptible, was a faint discoloration, a slightly different hue in the underlying concrete. It wasn't a burn mark, not exactly. More like a stain, a chemical residue that had been exposed to heat but hadn't fully combusted. And it wasn't uniform. It had a strange, almost feathered edge. "I see something," Miller asked, his tone laced with a hint of skepticism. He'd seen me do this 1,000 times, staring at nothing, only to pull a rabbit out of a hat. "Just looking for patterns," I replied, not elaborating. The stain was small, easily dismissed as collateral damage from the explosion, but it wasn't quite right. It didn't fit the expected dispersion of a pressure vessel rupture. It was too localized, too specific, like the striations on the bone fragment. The tension in the air was palpable, not just from the lingering scent of smoke, but from the weight of unspoken possibilities. Everyone else saw an accident. I saw an anomaly. Aris Thorne hadn't just made a mistake or chosen to end his life. Someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to ensure it looked that way. And I had a feeling those lengths were just beginning to unravel. The faint discoloration on the wall, a whisper of a different story beneath the ash, gnawed at me. My internal clock was already ticking, but I knew I couldn't dwell on it now. The lab was a sprawling canvas of destruction, demanding a methodical approach. My next stop, and the most critical, was the morgue. That's where Thorne would truly begin to speak. The air in the autopsy suite was a stark contrast to the acrid tang of the lab. Here, it was sterile, cold, tinged with the metallic scent of blood and disinfectant. The medical examiner, a no-nonsense woman with sharp eyes and even sharper scalpels, was already at work when I arrived. Dr. Aris Thorne lay on the stainless steel table, a sheet covering most of him. Even in death, his presence was unnerving, his potential for world-altering discoveries now reduced to a grim puzzle. "Read," the medical examiner acknowledged, his voice clipped, not looking up from him. Examination of Thorne's hands. "Initial observations are complicated." I pulled on a fresh pair of gloves and stepped closer, my gaze sweeping over the exposed skin. "Complicated how?" She gestured with a gloved hand towards Thorne's upper torso. "External burns are consistent with a high-energy thermal event, certainly. Severe charring on the arms, face, and chest, especially on the left side, indicating the blast force came primarily from that direction." She paused, her brow furrowing. "But the internal trauma, that's where it gets interesting. I'm seeing extensive internal organ damage, blast lung, ruptured spleen, but the bone fractures, particularly in the ribs, don't quite align with the external blast pattern. They're less severe than I'd expect for such a catastrophic external injury." My mind immediately flashed back to the lab, the strange discoloration on the wall, the way the debris had settled. "Less severe," I echoed, my voice low. "I rest suggesting the force wasn't as uniform as it appears." Or, she countered, adjusting her glasses, that something else contributed to the internal damage, or perhaps cushioned the external impact in specific areas. "It's early, of course, but it's an anomaly." She moved down to Thorne's feet. "And these?" His boots are largely intact, considering the proximity to the supposed epicenter. Some scorching, yes, but not the disintegration I'd anticipate. I leaned in, my eyes scanning the sole of one boot. The rubber was scuffed, slightly melted in places, but the tread pattern was still visible. Then something caught my eye. A minute speck, lodged deep in a groove of the sole, glinting dully. It was too small to identify definitively, but its color was off, an earthy, almost metallic rust hue that didn't belong in a sterile lab or on a city street. I retrieved a pair of fine-tipped tweezers from my kit. With painstaking precision, I dislodged the speck, dropping it into a small, sterile evidence bag. "This isn't ash, and it's not from the lab's flooring." The medical examiner glanced at it. Looks like some kind of mineral deposit. Very fine. Exactly. I confirmed, securing the bag. My mind raced. If this wasn't from the lab, where had it come from? And how had it ended up embedded in Thorne's boot? I'm sending this directly to the Forensic Anthropology Bone Analysis Lab. They have the advanced microscopy and elemental analysis capabilities to identify something like this. Leaving the medical examiner to her meticulous work, I made my way to the interview rooms. The inconsistencies at the autopsy, coupled with that tiny foreign speck, had cemented my suspicions. This wasn't a straightforward accident. My first interview was with Dr. Silas Vance, a rival bioengineer from a competing firm. He sat across from me, hands clasped tightly on the table, a nervous energy radiating from him. He was a man of precise movements and an even more precise vocabulary, his spectacles perched on his nose. Terrible tragedy, of course. Vance began, adjusting his tie. Aris was driven, brilliant certainly, but his methods were often unconventional, and his secrecy, well, it created a lot of friction. Friction with whom? I asked, leaning forward slightly. Vance hesitated, picking at a loose thread on his cuff. With many. He guarded his research like a dragon. My own project, for example, shares some conceptual similarities with his. We were in a race, I might say, to achieve a particular breakthrough. He saw me as a threat, always. Accused me of industrial espionage once, quite baseless, I assure I. His tone was defensive, a little too eager to paint Thorne as paranoid. And I, Dr. Vance, what was my relationship with him outside of professional rivalry? Minimal, competitive, yes. Respectful in a scientific sense, but friends, no. He wasn't a man who cultivated friendships. He cultivated intellectual property. The underlying resentment in his voice was clear, a thin veneer of civility struggling to contain it. The man had a motive, perhaps not for murder, but certainly for wanting Thorne out of the picture. Next was Maya, Thorne's former research assistant. He was younger than Vance, her face etched with a mix of grief and what looked like simmering anger. Her clothes were rumpled, her eyes red-rimmed. He worked me to the bone, she stated flatly, not mincing words. 7 days a week, sometimes 16-hour days. Promised me co-authorship on his big paper, a slice of the patent. Then 3 months ago he fired me, said I wasn't sufficiently dedicated. He took all my work, all my contributions, and just discarded me. Her voice cracked on the last word. Did I ever threaten him, Maya? She scoffed, a bitter sound. Threaten him? What good would that do? He held all the power. I just wanted my due. My name on the research, my share of the credit. He built his empire on the backs of people like me, then kicked us to the curb. Her gaze hardened. He was a user, a narcissist. I'm not saying I wished him dead, but a part of me isn't entirely surprised something happened. He made a lot of enemies. I watched her carefully, noting the tremor in her hands, the way she avoided my direct gaze when discussing her dismissal. Disgruntled, exploited, and with a clear sense of injustice. Another motive, equally potent, equally human. Leaving the interview rooms, the sterile air felt heavy. Vance, with his carefully worded animosity and professional rivalry, and Maya, with her raw, visceral anger over stolen credit. Both had plausible reasons to resent Thorne, even to wish him harm, but neither of them struck me as the kind of person who could orchestrate a sophisticated lab explosion and cover their tracks so meticulously. The inconsistencies from the autopsy, the unique mineral dust, the strange burn patterns, it all pointed to something far more calculated, far more intricate than a simple act of revenge or competitive sabotage. This case was quickly turning into a labyrinth, and I was just beginning to find my way in. The sterile air outside the interview room still clung to me, a lingering scent of disinfectant and stale coffee. I replayed the assistant's words in my head, the tight set of her jaw, the way her gaze darted to the window as she spoke of her dismissal. A potent cocktail, certainly, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was too neat, too obvious. My gut, a loyal if often inconvenient companion, nudged me towards something more intricate. I bypassed the main offices and headed for the secured server room, a place of hums and cool air, where the true heart of Thorne's work was being meticulously dissected. The digital forensics specialist, a young woman with a perpetually tired expression and fingers that danced across her keyboard, barely looked up as I entered. "Anything interesting, doctor?" I asked, pulling up a chair beside her workstation. The glow of multiple monitors cast a pale light on his face. "Interesting doesn't even begin to cover it, Reed," he murmured, his voice a low rumble. She gestured to a large screen displaying a complex network of folders and files. "Thorne's primary research server, highly encrypted naturally. Took us a good 6 hours to crack the initial layer." I leaned closer, my eyes scanning the file names. They were coded, of course, but even the nomenclature hinted at something significant. Project Chimera, Genesis Protocol, Antigen Matrix. This wasn't just basic research. This was the kind of work that made headlines or started wars. Genetic sequencing, I knew, was at its core the kind with potential applications in global health, or more darkly, bioweaponry. "We found something odd," the specialist continued, tapping a specific section of the timeline. "Access logs show a flurry of activity in the hours before the explosion, not just Thorne. There was an external login, a sophisticated bypass of the secondary firewall. Took a ghost route, masked its IP through a series of proxies." My breath caught. An external party. And what did they do? They accessed Project Chimera files multiple times. Then an attempted wipe. A very aggressive deletion protocol, almost successful. But she paused, zooming in on a series of fragmented data strings. They left traces, specific project files, the core sequencing data for what looks like a new viral vector were targeted for deletion. They didn't get everything. The hum of the servers suddenly seemed louder, more menacing. An attempted wipe. This wasn't a tragic accident. This wasn't a suicide. Someone had deliberately tried to erase Thorne's most sensitive research, and they had done it just hours before his lab went up in flames. The thought sent a cold shiver down my spine. This wasn't about a disgruntled employee. This was about the information itself. "Can you reconstruct any of the deleted data?" I asked, my voice tight. "Working on it. It's fragmented, but there's enough here to suggest they were trying to bury something very specific. Not just hide it, destroy it." I stood, the implications weighing heavily. If someone went to these lengths to manipulate Thorne's data to erase his work, then the accident was almost certainly a meticulously planned murder, designed to look like a tragic miscalculation. And if the research itself was the target, what did that mean for the body? My next stop was the forensic anthropology bone analysis lab. The air here was different, dry, sterile, and faintly metallic. The lab technician, a quiet woman with sharp, observant eyes, was hunched over a workstation, meticulously cataloging bone fragments. On a table in the center of the room, laid out on a clean white sheet, were Thorne's skeletal remains. They were largely intact, but the heat had done its work, turning the bones brittle, discolored in places. "Anything new on the remains?" I asked, approaching the table. I donned gloves, my eyes tracing the contours of the bone. "Still processing, Reed. The primary cause of death is consistent with the explosion's concussive force and thermal trauma. No obvious premortem fractures that we can definitively attribute to an attack." She pointed with a gloved finger to a section of the sternum. But I did note some unusual scorching patterns here, very localized, almost like a directed burst of heat rather than diffuse flame damage. I bent closer, examining the area. The heat was immense. But yes, it's not typical of generalized thermal exposure. It suggests a point source, something that superheated a very small area for a brief, intense moment. My mind raced. A localized burst of heat, a specific viral vector, an attempted data wipe just hours before. This wasn't a lab accident that led to a death. It was a death that was made to look like a lab accident, possibly using the very tools or research Thorne was developing. As I was leaving the bone lab, my thoughts still consumed by the possibilities, I spotted Maya, Thorne's assistant, by the vending machines in the deserted hallway. He was staring blankly at a bag of chips, her posture slumped, her shoulders drawn in. She looked like a ghost. "Maya," I said softly. She jumped, startling, her eyes wide with a fear I hadn't seen in her before. I was just getting something. "You seem on edge," I observed, keeping my tone gentle. She wrung her hands, her gaze flicking around the empty hallway as if expecting someone to materialize. "It's just Dr. Thorne. He was so paranoid those last few weeks. He kept saying he was being watched, that someone was after his work, not just competing after it, after him." "Did he say who?" She shook her head, a tremor running through her. "No, just vague things, but he was so convinced. He was always looking over his shoulder, locking his office door even when he was just stepping out for a minute. He changed all his passwords. Thorne's paranoia, Maya's fear, the targeted data wipe, the unusual burn pattern on his sternum. It all coalesced into a single, terrifying truth. This wasn't a simple case of a brilliant mind's tragic end. The killer had left a trail, but it was buried deep, requiring a forensic archaeologist to unearth. And I had a feeling I was only scratching the surface of what they wanted to hide. The sterile hum of the microspectrophotometer was the only sound that dared to break the silence in the forensic anthropology bone analysis lab. I leaned over the instrument, my gaze locked on the glowing sample stage, where a sliver of Thorne's sternum bone rested, clamped tight. The air, scrubbed and cool, carried the faint, metallic tang of ozone, a familiar scent that always signaled the meticulous work ahead. I felt the weight of Thorne's death pressing down, the horrifying certainty that this wasn't an accident, but a calculated execution. That unusual burn pattern on his sternum wasn't random, and neither was whatever microscopic residue I'd found embedded within it. My gut told me that trace element was the key. My fingers, steady and practiced, manipulated the controls, fine-tuning the focus. The digital display flickered, then resolved, presenting a magnified view of the bone's surface, a landscape of minute ridges and valleys. I zoomed in on the specific area, the edge of the burn where the tissue had been seared clean away. It was a painstaking process, almost meditative, sifting through the noise to find the signal. I adjusted the wavelength, cycling through the spectrum, waiting for something to register, something unique. Then it bloomed. A distinct, sharp peak on the spectral graph, a signature unlike anything I'd seen in a typical lab accident. My breath hitched, a small, involuntary gasp. I ran the analysis again, cross-referencing against known compounds in the forensic database. Nothing. This wasn't a common element. It was something exotic, something designed. I brought up the Advanced Spectral Library, a repository of rare and specialized materials. The machine word processing, comparing, its internal fans kicking up a notch. The seconds stretched, taut and silent, until a match flashed across the screen. My eyes scanned the details, the molecular structure, the characteristics. "Well, I'll be damned," I muttered, the words barely a whisper in the quiet lab. It was a synthetic polymer. Not just any polymer, but a highly specialized, rare variant, known for its extreme durability and resistance to heat and chemical degradation. Its applications were specific: high-end industrial uses, aerospace components, specialized medical devices, and crucially, certain cutting-edge research equipment. This wasn't something you'd find in a standard biolab, not even one as advanced as Thorne's. This was a signature of deliberate, external introduction. The kind of material that leaves no residue unless subjected to extreme, focused energy like the concentrated heat that caused that burn on Thorne's sternum. The pieces clicked into place. This polymer pointed away from Thorne's internal lab experiments, away from his personal life, and directly towards the external world, specifically to entities involved in advanced manufacturing or high-level research. And that brought me straight back to Omnicorp. Omnicorp. The name echoed in my mind. They were Thorne's primary financial backer, a conglomerate infamous for its aggressive R&D acquisitions and a ruthless pursuit of market dominance. They funded his work, they had a vested interest in his breakthroughs, and they had the resources to develop or procure such a specialized material. The connection felt chillingly clear. This wasn't just a murder, It was an industrial assassination. I left the lab, the image of that spectral peak burned into my mind, and immediately set up a meeting with OmniCorp's corporate liaison. The corporate offices were a stark contrast to the sterile precision of the lab, gleaming chrome and polished glass, hushed hallways, and the faint scent of expensive coffee and ambition. I was ushered into a spacious, minimalist conference room where the corporate liaison was already waiting. The liaison was a man in his late 40s, impeccably dressed in a charcoal suit, with a practiced smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. His handshake was firm, almost too firm. "Investigator Reed," he began, his voice smooth, "thank I for coming. We're of course absolutely devastated by Dr. Thorne's untimely passing, a true loss to the scientific community and to OmniCorp." "I appreciate my condolences," I said, taking a seat opposite him at the long mahogany table. "I'm here to discuss Dr. Thorne's research, specifically his funding and any materials OmniCorp might have supplied to his lab." The liaison nodded, still smiling. "Of course. OmniCorp was proud to support Dr. Thorne's groundbreaking work. Our commitment to innovation is unparalleled." He gestured vaguely. "We provided substantial grants, equipment, and access to our proprietary databases, whatever he needed to push the boundaries of bioengineering." "Did OmniCorp supply any specialized synthetic polymers to Dr. Thorne's lab?" I inquired, cutting to the chase. His smile didn't waver, but a flicker of something unreadable crossed his eyes. "Specialized polymers. Dr. Thorne had a vast array of materials at his disposal, investigator. Our supply chain is extensive." "Could I be more specific?" "A rare, high-performance synthetic polymer typically used in high-stress industrial applications," I clarified, watching him closely. He leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled, his posture relaxed, almost too relaxed. "Ah, I see. Well, Dr. Thorne's research was incredibly complex. He often requested unique materials for his experimental prototypes. It's certainly possible. Our R&D division frequently utilizes such materials. Perhaps one of our engineers could provide more specific details." He was offering to help. Deflecting, diverting. "I'd be interested in any records of such materials being transferred to his lab," I pressed. "Specifically, anything that might have left a unique spectral signature under extreme heat." The liaison's smile tightened just a fraction. "Extreme heat. Investigator, the initial findings indicated a catastrophic lab accident involving an energy surge. Such an event would, naturally, generate significant heat." He paused, then added, "As for records, our inventory systems are vast. It would take considerable time to cross-reference every material against every project, but we are, as always, fully cooperative. We want to assist in any way we can to understand this tragedy." "I understand," I replied, my voice even. "I'll need those records, the sooner the better." I knew he was playing for time, hiding behind the veneer of corporate helpfulness. His overly cooperative stance, the constant redirection, it all screamed evasion. The polymer was a smoking gun, and it pointed directly at OmniCorp. Thorne's paranoia wasn't unfounded. He wasn't just a target, he was a target of significant, well-resourced power, and I had just stepped onto their turf. The corporate manager's slick demeanor still grated on me, his words echoing with a hollow ring of false sincerity. The polymer, that tiny, insidious piece of evidence, was a direct link to a truth someone desperately wanted to keep buried. My gut told me the manager knew more than he let on, his evasiveness a clear signpost pointing toward a deeper conspiracy. I was determined to follow it, no matter how tangled the path. I left the main building, the afternoon sun a deceptive warmth against my skin. My mind was still dissecting the manager's every twitch, every calculated pause. I crossed the street towards my car, already mentally outlining the next steps in tracing that polymer. A low rumble grew behind me, louder than it should have been on this quiet street. I glanced over my shoulder, my senses suddenly on high alert. A dark sedan, its windows tinted, accelerated sharply from the intersection, veering subtly but unmistakably towards my side of the road. My breath caught. It wasn't a reckless driver, it was too precise. I reacted on instinct, a sharp jerk to the right, stumbling onto the narrow strip of grass bordering the pavement. It didn't brake, didn't swerve back. No horn, no shouted apology, just a deliberate, silent near miss. My heart hammered, a frantic drum against my ribs, but it wasn't fear. This wasn't an accident. This was a message. Someone was watching, and they didn't like what I was doing. The determination that had been simmering beneath the surface now solidified into an unshakable resolve. Back in my lab, the familiar scent of antiseptic and sterile equipment usually brought a sense of calm, but today, a prickle of unease accompanied me. I went straight to my desk, intent on reviewing the preliminary analysis of the polymer fragment. My eyes scanned the organized chaos of my workspace, stacks of reports, microscope slides, a half-empty coffee mug. Everything appeared normal, yet something tugged at the edge of my perception. I moved a file folder, a thick one detailing a previous case, from the corner of my desk. It was sitting on top of a loose memo I'd left there, a reminder to follow up on a specific database query. The memo wasn't flat. It was crumpled slightly at one corner, as if someone had picked up the file, read it, and then dropped it back down in haste. My pen, a specific blue gel pen I always kept in a particular groove on my desk organizer, was lying flat beside it, not upright. It was minuscule, almost imperceptible, but it was my lab. I knew the exact position of every item. Someone had been here. Not a cleaning crew, they wouldn't touch my desk. Not a colleague, they would have announced themselves. This was an intrusion, a deliberate, quiet violation. They hadn't taken anything obvious, hadn't left a mess. They just wanted me to know they'd been here. Another message. The near miss on the street, now this. The threats were escalating, becoming more personal. They wanted to intimidate me. They had underestimated me. Later that evening, as I was preparing to leave, a soft knock came at my lab door. I looked up to see Maya, the lab assistant who had worked closely with Dr. Thorne. "Can I talk to you for a moment, privately?" I nodded, gesturing her in and closing the door behind her. Her hands wrung together, a nervous habit I'd noticed before. I led her away from the main forensic lab, seeking a quieter, more isolated space. We ended up in the forensic anthropology bone analysis lab, the stark white tables and rows of skeletal remains offering a strange, unsettling privacy. The air was cool, carrying the faint, clean scent of processed bone. The silent witnesses of past tragedies seemed to amplify Maya's unease. He finally looked up at me, his gaze pleading. I know you're getting close to something, Reed. I've heard things. He was seeing things. And what happened to you today? I heard about it, the car. How did you hear about the car? I questioned, my voice low. I hadn't reported it, hadn't told anyone. She wrung her hands again. People talk. A colleague saw it from a window. He said it looked deliberate. That's when I knew I couldn't keep quiet anymore. She took a shaky breath, glancing at a skull resting on a nearby table, its empty eye socket seeming to stare back. Dr. Thorne. He was very particular about security, especially after hours. But I saw someone. My focus sharpened. Someone who? I don't know, she confessed, her voice thick with fear. This was maybe a week before the accident. I was working late, trying to finish some data entry. I was in the administrative office near the back exit, and I saw a light on in Dr. Thorne's lab. It was past midnight. I knew he wasn't supposed to be there, not that late, and he certainly wouldn't have left the lights on if he'd just stepped out. I thought maybe he'd forgotten something, so I went to check. She paused, swallowing hard. The main lab door was slightly ajar. I pushed it open a little more, just a crack, and I saw a figure inside, not Doctor. This person was taller, broader. They were hunched over his main workstation, and they had a small, bright light like a pen light shining on something, and gloves. I froze. Then I ran back to my office, locked the door, and waited until I was sure they were gone. I didn't say anything because I was scared, and then Dr. Thorne died, and I thought maybe it was just a coincidence, a hallucination from being tired. But now, with what's happening to you, I just can't shake it. An unknown individual accessing Thorne's lab after hours, wearing gloves, hunched over his workstation. The polymer, the threats, it all clicked into place. This wasn't a lab accident. It was a sophisticated, premeditated murder, and the killer was now actively trying to shut me down. Maya's confession, delivered amidst the silent testimony of Bone, was the confirmation I needed. I wasn't just investigating a death. I was now squarely in the crosshairs of a killer. Maya's confession had been a gut punch, not because he was the killer, but because she'd been the unwitting key. She hadn't pulled the trigger, but she'd opened the door for someone who did. Her face, etched with fear and regret, had confessed to letting a former colleague, a rival of Thorne's, into the facility after hours, citing an urgent need for archive data access. It was a favor, a misguided act of professional courtesy that had paved the way for murder. My mind, still reeling from the implications of the polymer trace and the chilling realization that the killer was actively trying to shut me down, now snapped into a new gear. If someone had been let into the building, their movements, even if not directly through Thorne's lab door, would have left a digital footprint. And if they were smart enough to bypass physical security, they were smart enough to use the building's own systems against Thorne. I needed space, quiet, and access to a robust network. The general forensics lab was a hive of activity, too many distractions, too many eyes. My gaze fell on the door to the forensic anthropology bone analysis lab. It was usually deserted this late, the specialists having long since packed up their articulated skeletons and delicate tools. Perfect. I slipped inside, the heavy door thudding softly behind me, muffling the distant hum of the building. The air in here was cool, dry, and carried the faint, clean scent of sterilized bone, a stark contrast to the metallic tang of Thorne's lab. Rows of neatly arranged skeletal remains, labeled and catalogued, stared from their shelves, silent witnesses to countless past mysteries. A human femur, polished smooth by time and careful handling, lay beside a tray of carpal bones, each one a tiny, intricate puzzle piece. I pushed aside a partially articulated human hand, its metacarpals gleaming under the harsh fluorescent lights, to make room for my laptop. It felt almost sacrilegious, bringing the digital chaos of the living world into this sanctuary of the dead. But this quiet, secure space was exactly what I needed to sift through the digital debris of Thorne's final moments. I connected my specialized interface to the facility's central server, bypassing the usual security protocols with a few lines of code. I needed to access the environmental control logs, the security camera feeds, and the access card records for the night of Thorne's death. The detective had already pulled the basic door logs for Thorne's lab, but I suspected they were looking at the wrong door. Maya's confession pointed to a more subtle infiltration. I started with the facility's master access logs. My fingers flew across the keyboard, a blur of motion as I navigated through encrypted directories. Maya's colleague, a former research partner. That narrowed the field, but not enough. I filtered by after-hours access, cross-referencing with Thorne's last known movements. There it was, a log entry for the main entrance, about an hour after Thorne was last seen exiting his lab for the night. Maya's card, and then, a few minutes later, an internal door near the server room accessed by another card, one registered to a former senior researcher, a name I recognized, Dr. Elias Vance. Vance. He'd been a rival of Thorne's, known for his volatile temper and a public falling out over intellectual property years ago. A very strong suspect indeed. But how did Vance get Thorne's internal lab keycard data, or bypass it entirely to reach the specific controls? This was where the environmental systems came in. I burrowed deeper into the building's integrated climate control. Thorne's lab, being high security, had its own bespoke system, separate but networked to the main grid. It monitored everything: air pressure, oxygen levels, specific gas concentrations, temperature, humidity. An internal alarm system designed for containment breaches, not human intrusion. The data streamed across my screen, an endless river of numbers and timestamps, a digital autopsy of Thorne's last hours. Most of it was standard, the rhythmic pulse of a high-tech facility. Then I found it. Not a single violent spike, but a series of anomalies, starting roughly 30 minutes after Vance's presumed entry into the facility. A deliberate, almost surgical manipulation designed to be overlooked. First, a subtle drop in the lab's ambient pressure, a mere whisper of a change, just enough to trigger a minor recalibration warning on the system's internal diagnostics. Easily dismissed as a sensor glitch, a phantom reading in a complex environment. But it was the precursor. Then a gradual, almost imperceptible increase in a specific noble gas argon. Not enough to be immediately lethal, not enough to trigger an alarm, but enough to begin displacing oxygen slowly, insidiously over the course of hours. This wasn't a gas leak. This was a controlled infusion, a calculated poisoning, introduced directly into the lab's ventilation system, bypassing the regular air filtration. The genius and the horror of it was the timing. The increase in argon corresponded perfectly with Thorne's usual late-night work schedule, often involving complex, multi-stage experiments that demanded his full, unwavering focus. He would have attributed the subtle lightheadedness, the slight disorientation, the growing fatigue, to the demanding nature of his work, or perhaps simply a long day. His cognitive functions, his fine motor skills, would have been slowly compromised, making him prone to what would appear to be a mistake. But there was more. The temperature log, a sharp, brief spike, precisely when Thorne would have been initiating the crucial final phase of his polymer synthesis, the phase requiring specific heat application. This wasn't an accidental overheating. This was a command, a remote override to the lab's localized heating coils, pushing them past their safety limits, but only for a few critical minutes. Just long enough. The sequence clicked into place with a sickening finality, each digital breadcrumb leading to a horrifying conclusion. It was a perfectly choreographed death. 1. Remote access. Vance, or someone acting on his behalf, accessed the building's central network via an internal access point, likely using his old credentials and Maya's unwitting assistance to gain entry to the building itself. From there, he found a backdoor, a vulnerability in the network systems that allowed him to reach Thorne's isolated lab controls. 2. Atmospheric manipulation. He initiated the slow, silent argon release, a hypoxic environment, gradually impairing Thorne's judgment and motor skills, turning his brilliant mind against itself. This was the accident waiting to happen, a setup for a fatal error. 3. Targeted overload. At the precise moment Thorne, in his compromised state, would be handling the volatile polymer, the one I'd found microscopic traces of on the lab floor, a remote command overloaded the heating coils. This wouldn't just cause a fire. In a low oxygen, high argon environment combined with Thorne's impaired state, it would create a flash combustion, an explosion that would look exactly like a catastrophic research malfunction. The polymer, designed to be stable under specific conditions, would become a deadly accelerant, igniting with the force of a small bomb. 4. Cover-up. The system logs were then scrubbed, not perfectly, but enough to make it look like a spontaneous event. The pressure the remote override. That single damning detail gnawed at me, a persistent itch under my skin. It wasn't just a miscalculation on Thorne's part, nor was it a simple accident. Someone, somewhere, had deliberately initiated that thermal spike, timing it perfectly to coincide with the most volatile phase of Thorne's polymer synthesis. This wasn't a smash-and-grab for research data. This was an execution, meticulously engineered to look like a tragic oversight. I paced the sterile floor of the forensic anthropology bone analysis lab, the hum of its specialized equipment a low thrum against the otherwise quiet space. It wasn't my usual haunt, but the secure network connection here, isolated from the general campus grid, was exactly what I needed. The air carried a faint, almost imperceptible scent of disinfectant and something else. A dry, earthy smell, like old linen and dust, clinging to the bone fragments carefully laid out on the adjacent examination tables. A colleague, a quiet woman with sharp eyes and even sharper instruments, was meticulously cleaning a pelvis fragment at a workstation across the room, her gloved fingers delicate as she brushed away adhering soil. She offered a brief, knowing nod when I entered, then returned to her work, leaving me to my own digital excavation. My monitor glowed, displaying the labyrinthine directory structure of Thorne's encrypted personal drive. The sheer complexity of the murder method, the almost theatrical staging of the accident, screamed a motive far deeper than intellectual property theft. If the killer simply wanted Thorne's work, they could have just stolen the data or even abducted him. No, this felt different. This felt like an act of prevention, of suppression. Someone didn't want Thorne's research completed or, more importantly, released. I leaned closer to the screen, my reflection ghosting in the glass. I'd spent days sifting through his official lab logs, his emails, his digital drafts, all meticulously organized, almost too perfect. That was the first clue, really. Thorne was brilliant, yes, but also notoriously disorganized in his personal digital life. His lab, however, was a temple to order. This personal drive, though, felt like a carefully curated public face. What was he hiding in the shadows? My fingers flew across the keyboard, running deeper scans, looking for anomalies in metadata, for file remnants that didn't quite fit the pristine narrative. The fluorescent lights above cast a harsh, unforgiving glow on the bone analysis tools laid out nearby: calipers, probes, brushes glinting like surgical instruments. Each item spoke of precise, painstaking work, much like my own, just on a different kind of canvas. Hours bled into one another. My eyes ached, but the puzzle pieces were starting to shift. I found it. A series of tiny, almost imperceptible data packets, fragmented and scattered across what appeared to be deleted system files. It was like finding microscopic bone fragments in a vast excavation site, each one hinting at a larger structure. I started piecing them together, reconstructing the data stream bit by painstaking bit. The process was slow, maddeningly so. Each successful reconstruction met with another layer of obfuscation. This wasn't just encryption, it was a digital labyrinth designed by someone who understood security on a profound level. "Anything interesting?" "Read," my colleague asked, his voice a low murmur, not looking up from him. "Bone fragment. Just ghosts in the machine," I replied, my gaze fixed on the screen, a very deliberate attempt to bury something. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, a single, unassuming folder materialized on the screen, labeled only with a string of alphanumeric characters. My heart hammered a little faster. This was it. I clicked it open, and a series of dated entries appeared, each one a log file encrypted with a complex, multi-layered cipher. Thorne hadn't just wanted to hide this, he'd wanted to make it virtually unfindable. I started the decryption process, the processor word struggling under the strain. Minutes stretched into an eternity. I could feel the tension tightening in my chest, a cold knot of anticipation. This wasn't just about how Thorne died anymore, it was about why. And the why was always the most dangerous part. Then the first entry unfurled. October 14th. Thorne's precise, academic prose filled the screen, but underneath it, a tremor of moral conflict was palpable. My polymer research, while groundbreaking, carries inherent risks. The potential for weaponization, particularly by entities lacking ethical oversight, is a constant and growing concern. The applications I envisioned, medical advancements, sustainable infrastructure, are being overshadowed. My breath hitched. Weaponization. I scrolled down, my eyes devouring the words. November 2nd. My conversations with OmniCorp regarding project funding have taken a disturbing turn. They are not merely interested in accelerating my work. They appear to be diverting resources, funding a parallel, clandestine project. A sister project, as a high-ranking executive euphemistically called it, leveraging principles derived from my research, but with a far more aggressive and dangerous application. OmniCorp, the corporate behemoth that had funded Thorne's entire lab. November 28th. I have begun compiling irrefutable evidence. The ethical implications of their sister project are catastrophic. I cannot allow this to proceed. I intend to expose OmniCorp's clandestine funding, their true intentions, and the horrifying trajectory of this separate, more dangerous discovery. This wasn't about stealing Thorne's polymer, it was about silencing him. He wasn't just a brilliant scientist, he was a whistleblower poised to expose a corporate giant and its terrifying secret. And they had achieved it with a precision and brutality that now felt sickeningly clear. The stakes had just escalated beyond a simple murder investigation. This was a war, and Thorne had been the first casualty. The sterile hum of the server racks was a constant, low thrum in the forensic anthropology bone analysis lab, a stark contrast to the silence of the bone fragments meticulously arranged on trays around me. I had commandeered one of the lab's larger workstations, the kind with multiple monitors perfect for juggling data streams. On one screen, Thorne's encrypted research log scrolled, its final entry still burning in my mind. On another, I had the full employee roster of OmniCorp and Thorne's lab, complete with security clearances and departmental affiliations. A third displayed the intricate schematics of the lab's security system, detailing every access point, every sensor, every blind spot. My gut clenched with a cold certainty. Thorne wasn't just a brilliant scientist. He was a liability, a loose end about to expose something monumental. The thought had settled in my brain like a cold stone. This wasn't about stealing his polymer. It was about silencing him before he could reveal whatever truth was contained in that final cryptic log entry. The implication made my search for the killer feel less like a puzzle and more like a hunt. I started with the access logs, cross-referencing them against the time of the incident. The system had been deliberately compromised, an internal bypass rather than a brute force external hack. That narrowed the field significantly. Only a handful of individuals possessed the highest level access codes, a group that included Thorne himself, his lead research assistant, the facility manager, and notably the OmniCorp liaison, a man named David Thorne. No relation, I'd been told, but the coincidence of the surname had always pricked at my subconscious. The lead research assistant was a brilliant, but socially awkward individual, whose expertise lay solely in biochemistry. He wouldn't have the network engineering skills to bypass the system with such surgical precision. The facility manager was an older man, meticulous to a fault, but his background was in structural engineering, not digital forensics or covert operations. He lacked the specific technical skill set to orchestrate such a sophisticated sabotage. I pulled up the employee profiles for the remaining high-clearance individuals, focusing on their declared skill sets and employment histories. Most were straightforward, linear careers in scientific research or corporate management. Then I hit David Thorne's file. The first red flag was a gap. A 2-year period in his early career, listed simply as consulting, without any specific company or project. That kind of vagueness in a corporate file always raised my hackles. Below it, his listed skills included advanced network architecture and security systems integration. Technical enough, certainly, but the next entry made me pause, my fingers hovering over the trackpad. Prior experience in sensitive data protection and operational logistics. Operational logistics. That was a euphemism, I knew, for more than just moving crates. It suggested a tactical background, a comfort with high-stakes environments. I felt a prickle of unease, a familiar sensation when I was closing in on something dangerous. I leaned back, taking a breath, the scent of antiseptic and faint decay from the lab specimens a grounding anchor. This wasn't enough, not yet. I needed more. I opened a new browser window, careful to route my search through a secure, untraceable connection. Corporate records, public databases, old news archives. I typed in David Thorne and Omnicorp and started digging deeper, specifically looking for anything that might explain that consulting gap or hint at a more clandestine past. It took another hour, sifting through layers of carefully curated public information, before I found it. An obscure academic journal article, dating back almost 15 years, detailing a significant intellectual property theft from a competing biotech firm. The article mentioned an internal investigation, a subsequent legal battle, and the quiet dismissal of several key personnel. One of the names listed in the internal report, buried in a footnote, was a D. Thorne, then an IT specialist for the firm, covert operations, advanced network architecture, and a past scandal involving stolen intellectual property, where he might have been either a perpetrator or an instrumental, off-the-book solution. Either way, it suggested a man who knew how to operate in the gray areas, a man who understood how to manipulate systems and disappear without a trace. David Thorne, the Omnicorp liaison, wasn't just a corporate suit. He was an inside man, with the specific technical skills, the operational background, and now, a potential motive rooted in a history of corporate espionage and intellectual property protection. The tension in the lab was no longer just the hum of the servers. It was the quiet thrum of a predator, finally identified. The faint hum of the air filtration system was the loudest sound in the forensic anthropology bone analysis lab. It was a sterile, cold environment, filled with the quiet dignity of the deceased. Rows of meticulously organized skeletal remains gleamed under the overhead lights, each bone a silent testament to a life lived and ended. My gaze drifted over the specialized tools, calipers, osteometric boards, microscopes perched like watchful sentinels. The air carried a subtle, almost imperceptible scent of cleaning agents and something else, something mineral and ancient, a reminder of the raw material of our work. I leaned against a stainless steel counter, my hands tucked into the pockets of my lab coat, the worn fabric of familiar comfort. A few days earlier, I'd started a whisper campaign. A calculated leak, nothing official, just enough for the right ears to pick up. I'd mentioned, casually, to a junior analyst in the break room, within earshot of a particular data terminal, that we were making headway with Aris's research. Specifically, I'd hinted at the isolation of a unique protein chain, a stabilizer that Aris had apparently developed. I painted it as the missing piece, the element that made his bioagent not just potent but terrifyingly controllable. The implication was clear. We were on the verge of replicating it, of understanding its full, dangerous scope. It was bait, pure and simple. If Aris was killed to suppress his work, then the discovery of this stabilizer, a complete fabrication on my part, would be a significant threat. It would mean his research could still be exploited or worse, exposed. I watched the internal network traffic, a digital fishing line cast into murky waters. Sure enough, the next morning, the system logs showed an unauthorized access attempt. Not a brute force hack, but a sophisticated, almost surgical probe, aimed directly at the servers containing Aris Thorne's archived data. It was quickly thwarted by our enhanced firewalls, but the signature of the attempt was familiar, mirroring some of the sophisticated digital footprints I'd seen in the initial lab breach. Then came the call. A security guard reported a suspicious individual attempting to gain entry to the evidence locker, claiming to be Aris's relative authorized to collect personal effects. The guard, following my discreet prior instructions, had politely but firmly denied access, citing ongoing investigation protocols. The individual had left, but not before lingering, glancing back at the reinforced door. My internal alarm bells, already jangling, now rang with a deafening clang. David Thorne. He'd taken the bait, and he was getting sloppy. I arranged a meeting, a discreet one here in the bone lab. I wanted him to feel the weight of what we did, the finality of it. He arrived punctually, dressed in a sharp suit, his composure carefully constructed. He offered a strained smile. "Reed, thank you for seeing me. I was hoping for an update on Aris's things. The family is understandably eager for closure. I gestured to the empty examination table in the center of the room. Please, David, take a seat. I didn't sit, preferring to stand to maintain a certain advantage. About Aris's affairs, we've made some significant progress, more than just closure, I think. His eyes flickered, a momentary tremor in his carefully maintained calm. Oh, good, anything that sheds light on the accident. Accident, I repeated, letting the word hang in the quiet air. We've been focusing on the details, the tiny things, the almost invisible, like this. I picked up a Petri dish from a nearby cart, holding it up. Inside, under a powerful magnification, was a barely visible speck. This, David, is a unique polymer, custom synthesized. We first found traces of it in Aris's lab near the primary containment unit. I'm not sure I follow. What does a polymer have to do with anything? Everything, I answered, my voice low. This particular polymer, Aris used it in his advanced containment protocols. He was paranoid, you see, about cross-contamination. He used it as a marker, a signifier for anyone handling his most sensitive materials. I paused, letting him absorb that. We found more of it. On the soles of your shoes, David, from a recent inspection of Aris's lab, an inspection you performed after the official forensic sweep. You claimed you were tidying up his affairs. His composure began to crack. That's circumstantial. I was just trying to help. Help, David. I stepped closer, my voice unwavering. Or cover your tracks. Because we also found traces of this polymer in the security console Aris used on the very last keyboard he touched, after the explosion. It wasn't his polymer, David. It was yours, or rather, it was used by the person who manually initiated the overload sequence, the person who made it look like an accident. He clenched his fists, gripped tight. His carefully constructed facade was crumbling. You're making wild accusations. Am I? I picked up another sealed evidence bag, this one containing a small, charred circuit board fragment. This is from the explosion site. Aris's system was designed with multiple fail-safes. For it to fail catastrophically, every single one had to be overridden, manually, and guess what? The forensic analysis of the residue on the manual override controls showed traces of the same polymer. His breath hitched. He looked around the lab as if seeking an escape, but there was nowhere to go. The silent remains seemed to judge him. Aris found out about the bioweapon development. I continued, pressing my advantage. He was horrified. He threatened to expose OmniCorp, to blow the whistle on the unethical research they were pushing him towards. He was going to reveal everything, including the specific stabilizer he'd developed, the very thing OmniCorp wanted to weaponize. David finally broke. His shoulders sagged, and the carefully maintained mask fell away, revealing a man consumed by fear and guilt. He was going to ruin everything, he choked out, his voice raw. OmniCorp. They couldn't let that happen, the project, the investment, the potential. They tasked me to neutralize him, to acquire his research quietly. I was part of the operational logistics team, you see. I knew how to make things disappear. Aris was stubborn. He wouldn't listen to reason. He wouldn't just hand it over. He looked up at me, his eyes pleading. It was an order. I didn't want to, but if I didn't, they would have done it anyway, and I would have been next. He swallowed hard, the confession spilling out now, a torrent. I set the overload. I made it look like a tragic accident. I took the samples of the stabilizer. I tried to clean up. I didn't know you'd find the polymer. The lab was silent again, save for the hum of the filtration system. The motive was greed, power, and the terrifying potential of science unbound by ethics. And the proof, the irrefutable proof, lay in a microscopic trace, a polymer that had been his undoing.